The Shadow King, an Aboriginal adaptation of King Lear, and its resistance to Western conceptions of land ownership. Yes. So my PhD project is on Indigenous adaptations of Shakespeare in Australia from the 1990s to the present. It engages with calls for decolonization and debates about the future of both Shakespeare studies and performance. Scholars have often focused on land in King Lear, pointing out how Lear's division of the realm in the opening scene, or his darker purpose, as he says, sets in motion the play's tragic plot while also raising questions about kingship and sovereignty that had emerged in the early years of the Stuart monarchy. I've put the quote up as a reminder. So he says, the kingdom's divided in three, and then he makes his daughters, which of you shall we say doth love us most, bid for the biggest piece of land with declarations of love. So why does Lear divide up the land now, is a question, for instance, instead of having his eldest daughter, or rather her husband, just inherit it in due time? And also, why does the play not make any mention of how the land is already in use in ways that might complicate the seemingly arbitrary division that Lear is so casually imposing? It's precisely such tacit questions about land, its ownership and sovereignty that The Shadow King takes up. The Shadow King is a 2014 Aboriginal adaptation of King Lear by Balang Tom E. Lewis and Michael Cantor at Melbourne's Malthouse Theatre. After its initial run in Melbourne in 2013, it was remounted in Sydney a year later and then in London in 2016. The Shadow King's rereading of the play offers a culturally grounded Aboriginal perspective on land, thereby opening up new potential understandings of Shakespeare's tragedy. The adaptation, which reworks the play as a sprawling, blood-soaked tale of two Indigenous families in Australia's north, contrasts conflicting Western and Aboriginal ideas about land. Land's already suggested as central in the description of the play as well, as a parable that echoes our nation's history of a scale and significance to match the land on which it's made. The play not only confronts Australia's colonial history, but also demonstrates the urgent need for a decolonization or re-evaluation of ideas around land and power, particularly in light of the ongoing climate crisis. And in doing so, it highlights the value of alternative or alternative perspectives in reframing Western culture's relationship to nature. In Lewis and Cantor's adaptation, Lear's central conflict extends from a distorted view of the relationship between humankind and land. While the notion of territory as property is not entirely foreign in Aboriginal cultures, relations to the land are generally based on ancestral links, community, and a sense of connection and a duty of care to the land, which marks a key difference from the system of property ownership that was introduced through colonialism, which is centered on individuals owning separate plots of land to be mainly used for commercial exploitation. There's two things that jump out in the way the Shadow King reframes the play. First of all, the Shadow King opens with the Fool, who introduces the story as a Dreamtime story, an Aboriginal concept I will return to in a bit. So he says it's a foundational story of Western culture, one of your Dreamtime stories, which the Aboriginal creators will now make their own. And then he says, he specifically points out that the story involves kings and crowns and this place, this buru that we are and share. Buru is an Aboriginal word here used to refer to place. So this place that we are and share. And then later, after everything's already fallen apart and Lear finally comes to his senses and reunites with Cordelia, Lear asks, am I in another country? And Cordelia says, no, this is the land that is us. So the land that is us rather than ours, which embodies a rejection of the Western sense of land ownership that guided Lear in the opening scene. I'll return to the opening scene in The Shadow King at the end. So that sense of land ownership that guided Lear and that disturbed their connection to each other and to their homeland. Because, you know, the opening scene is also where Lear ends up banishing Cordelia, and everything falls apart. And then here in the second box, through a sort of ceremonial moment with red dirt, Cordelia takes some of the red earth and sprinkles it on Lear, and it slowly rejuvenates him. So through a ceremonial moment with red dirt and then dance and song as well, they reconnect to both each other and the land. Now, to understand the different conceptions of land ownership in conflict here, we need to examine the fundamental differences in their metaphysical foundations. So Western versus Indigenous Australian ways of being and knowing. While there's many differences between the different Indigenous Australian cultures, the relationship between Indigenous Australian peoples and their land is generally based on non-material, non-commercial foundations, and its primary significance is usually cultural. So land has cultural and spiritual significance. Rather than owning the land in the Western sense of property, Aboriginal people believe they belong to the land, which is an important distinction. Because ownership of transferable property, valued in terms of monetary or commercial gain, implies a one-way hierarchical relation and an emphasis on the right to use, whereas belonging to implies a reciprocal connection that comes with responsibility, a duty or a call to care for the land. Now, while Indigenous Australian groups have now been recognized as the traditional owners of their land in recent years, some people have argued that to avoid the misconception implied in the imposition of a Western concept of ownership in the term traditional owners, it's more accurate to speak of traditional custodians or caretakers. But of course, not everyone agrees with that, and the terminology struggle is also complicated by their struggle for recognition of their connection to the land in legal terms. Now, the Shadow King mobilizes three complex, related, and at times used interchangeably concepts that are central to Aboriginal people's relationship to their land: country, dreaming, and songlines. Country, capitalized, is a term Indigenous Australian people use to refer to their lands, including waterways and sky, but it represents much more than a physical geographical place or a piece of land. The capitalization of country, which turns it into a proper noun, affirms its significance in Aboriginal culture and embodies its connection to people. Now, a couple quotes to get a better sense of it. The first one: country is family, culture, identity, country is self. So clearly, country is more than a view of landscape. It's a belief system and a worldview. It's related to identity and sense of self. It is not a surface thing. It is not cartographic. We see country as a living being. So you've got to care for it, ancestrally, spiritually, and every other way. In the Aboriginal worldview, everything starts and ends with country, and everything is part of a continuum emanating from country, which some refer to as the dreaming. So these concepts are very interconnected. There is no separation between the animate and inanimate. Everything is living. There's also no separation between past and present because everything is seen as ongoing. Country is also a web of mythologies, a storied landscape. Again, this is the dreaming, the law. So all very interconnected. Now, that brings us to dreaming, also referred to as dream time, but this is sometimes seen as a distortion because it again implies a Western sense of time that doesn't really apply to the concept because everything is seen as still ongoing. Now, the dreaming has been described as a religious tradition, a landesque ideology. At its core, ancestral beings travel across the land, leaving traces of their activities and so shaping the landforms, or physical traces of themselves in local landforms where they are still present. So there's still a spiritual presence of the ancestors in country. Their journeys created the mythological trails we think of as dreaming tracks or songlines. So in Aboriginal creation stories, creator ancestors created the land or country, and in doing so, passed on a connection between people and place and past and present, and with it, a responsibility for people to care for country and all that it holds. Country also holds knowledge, which is captured in songlines or dreaming tracks. So where Western culture stores their knowledge in books, for Aboriginal people, cultural knowledge can be inscribed in the land and activated and passed on through stories or song or dance. Songlines are stories that allow Aboriginal people to navigate, care for, and survive in country. A specific example of a songline could be about where to find a water hole or another food source, or when and where to hunt for kangaroos, or things like that. But it's also more than that. Songlines are also described as a kind of scripture, a framework for relating people to land, and also showing that this relationship is inalienable. So that's also connected to the law and dreaming. So songlines relate individual people to specific places, and through sacred knowledge that's specific and localized. And desert people know in detail only part of a dreaming track or narrative, so you can imagine like a dreaming track as a story that runs over a whole area of a country, but each tribe or each mob living in specific parts of that country would know the songlines or dreaming the part that's in their tribal land. With that specific and localized sacred knowledge. So this creates a nexus of place, totemic identity, and land title, captured in the vernacular phrase belonging to country. There's also a secret/sacred element to songlines, which entails that, in a sense, songlines form part of a charter to land. Because in Aboriginal context, knowledge of an area's songs can be equivalent to a title deed for the land. So knowing the songs of a specific country shows that you belong to that country. And also within specific groups, there's layers to cultural authorities who know certain songlines. So by mobilizing Aboriginal people's connection to country and bringing these indigenous concepts around land into conflict with the Western concept of property, the Shadow King changes and arguably raises the stakes of Lear's famous opening scene in a way that opens up an enriching understanding of the ensuing tragedy. When the Aboriginal Lear decides to divide the land he owns between his daughters, he's effectively selling it to the highest bidders because he's making them bid for it through declarations of love. And in doing so, within this framework, he's selling much more than land, because remember, country is family, country is self, country is much more than land. He's arbitrarily splitting up and giving out country and everything that comes with that for all the wrong reasons, because he's thinking and talking in terms of ownership and personal gain rather than custodianship and communal and cultural ties. And you can see that language at work in the adaptation. Lear, the Aboriginal Lear here, is talking about his darker purpose still. And then he says, we're going to be rich. And the mob, the tribe, cheers. And he's dividing everything he owns, all this land, and in particular all the wealth that will flow from it. He's tired of playing the white fella game, striking the deals, which also alludes to debates in Aboriginal communities about accepting mining royalties, so striking deals with mining companies. And then he says it's time for the young to be weighed down by such things. Speak for country, which is ironic because he's not speaking for country at all. He's speaking for himself mostly. He is, to use his own words, still playing the white fella game. And this is exactly, in the adaptation, his madness. He has lost sight of his relationship to country. So the Shadow King in this way reflects Australia's colonial past back at its present, by foregrounding conflicting views of relations to land and of kingship and kinship. The adaptation demonstrates the tragic consequences of the dominant Western vision of land ownership, and in doing so, it tells a tale of resistance against the hierarchical and exploitative nature of that view, and the approach to land management that comes with it, expressing an urgent need to reconceptualize our relation to the natural world and resources more broadly, in the context of climate crisis. To tie it all back again to the theme of resistance and climate crisis and the keynote lecture from yesterday, you could say that the Shadow King mourns a connection to country that was lost, and it shows or it warns against the tragic consequences of that. But it also, and I think Caroline also mentioned this briefly, offers moments or glimmers of resistance and hope. This is certainly true here, by showing the potential for reconnection, for instance, in Lear's transformation towards the end, facilitated by Cordelia, who very much from the beginning is a figure of resistance, because she never loses that connection and that faith. And also in highlighting the value of indigenous ways of relating to the land, the Shadow King also connects to recent calls from scientists in Australia to bring back practices, land management practices that Aboriginal people were using for thousands of years before colonialism, and that are informed by this way of relating to the land, but that were then completely devalued and are now being revalued. And on top of all of that, I didn't get to focus on that here, but I want to close off by saying that with the history of Shakespeare's entanglement with colonialism, the act of taking a Shakespearean tragedy and turning it into an Aboriginal dreaming story in itself, told by an all-Aboriginal cast as well, is in itself also an act of resistance. Thank you.